It's almost Halloween, so what's your pleasure? Suspense or gore? Yeah, it's the episode that's coming out closest to Halloween, so we got to get all thematic with it. Well, we don't have to, but I like to. And I don't have anything particular in mind, at least as far as specifics go. So I thought this time it'd be nice to talk more broad strokes. Because if we're talking horror, if we're talking scary, I feel like a lot of entertainment can be lumped into leaning primarily into one of two things: suspense and gore. Now, one can make the argument that those are not mutually exclusive. You can have both. And I would say, yes, that's true. But I feel like most films that sort of fall into the horror setting or genre for the most part tend to lean one way or the other. And in some cases, very, very, very heavily. There are some incredibly suspenseful, tense movies that have not a lot of gore, some even at PG-13. I'll cite you at least one later. And there are plenty of gore-filled films, television now, thanks to the fewer restrictions on things like streaming, that are not suspenseful. And they're not tense. They're not even necessarily trying to be. Whether intended or not, these two aspects are often at odds with each other. At least they are for me as a viewer. And I find it interesting to talk about why that is and why I tend to favor suspense over gore. At least I am if you're going to make me choose. Let's talk broad strokes here. What is suspense? Suspense is that tension. The classic way to describe that was done by Alfred Hitchcock. Horrible man, great director. There have been a lot of them, if you weren't aware. But he said that if you have a scene set at a restaurant and a bomb goes off and it just blows up the restaurants, you can startle the audience for basically a second at the moment of detonation. However, if you show the audience the bomb under the table at the beginning of the scene, then you will have 10 minutes worth of tension as they know that bomb is going to go off. Now, that's a very simplified way of putting it, but basically, startling is easy. Anybody can startle. Building tension, building suspense, making people afraid of what comes next, partly because they aren't entirely sure what it's going to be, of not knowing when it's going to happen, even if they have a sense of what it will be, that takes some craft. That's not to say that gore doesn't. When I say gore, I mean over the top, gooey, drippy, bloody depictions of physical violence. There is a craft to gore as well, although I would say more often than not, the craft in gore is on the part of the special effects team, and not necessarily the directors, the writers, the cinematographers. They can do things to enhance or best present that, but I honestly feel like when I see something with good gore, at least is praised as having good gore, I'm praising the efforts of the effects team more than anybody else. Whereas something that is suspenseful, that is tense, well, that's across the board. That's the script. That's the actors. That's the director, the cinematographer, the music, if they do it right. That all builds the tension. Whereas the gore is, well, it's kind of just however long it's on the screen. Now, granted, part of my feeling about that being a dichotomy probably has a little bit to do with my age, because let's be honest, gore as a real sort of thing unto itself in horror, the idea that horror is or should be some kind of delivery vehicle for gory kills, that sense is kind of very informed by my growing up in the 80s and 90s. Lots of 80s classics, some I like, many of which bore me, that gorehounds really love. All kinds of zombie movies, all kinds of, the Return of the Living Dead, and all these, gritty, nasty, practical head decapitation. Like, it started in the 70s. The 80s is where it kind of took off. Like, you don't watch Friday the 13th because you want to feel tense. You do it to see the bloody kills. And I'm not knocking that as an experience. There can be catharsis and enjoyment in that. But again, for me at least, it's rarely scary. And it often seemed, especially in the 80s and into the 90s, that if something was going for gore, that it basically just didn't bother being suspenseful. Like, no, look, we're here for the gore. We know that's what you're here for, so just let us do this, is what it could often feel like. And not even necessarily in a they're not putting any effort into any other parts of the thing sort of way. There were films that were gory that just, weren't trying to be scary. And while you would get a handful of gory and suspenseful films, I think John Carpenter's The Thing probably stands, at least from the 80s, as a really good example of something that did both, with very visceral body horror imagery, but also being very tense for its paranoid setting. That is an exemplar and a luminary of the era for a reason. It's an exception. Most gore just wasn't too concerned with being suspenseful or even scary. It was there to be fun. And I'm not above finding gore fun, but that's actually part of why I think I enjoy gore more in action movies than I do in horror movies. Because, as I said, gore can be cathartic. And actually, as a punctuation to an action scene, like a really knockdown, drag-out fight between a hero I'm rooting for and a villain I hate, to punctuate that with gore at the end, yeah, that can enhance the moment in a way that makes you pump your fist in the air. So again, I'm not knocking gore on its own. But sort of moving on past the 80s and 90s, that's when we got Saw, and we hit Hostel, and we got the torture porn era. And I feel like in many ways that was an attempt to strip the silliness and the fun out of gore. Because while it wasn't really to my taste, most gory movies from the 80s, the 90s, they were fun. They were designed to be fun, by and large. Once you started getting into these things, these things aren't to my taste. So I'm not being like, nobody would like this, but they're not trying to be fun. They're trying to be visceral. They're trying to be unsettling. But the sense of fun that used to be there was kind of gone. And while that dynamic has shifted in terms of the way gore-heavy horror films are being utilized in more recent time versus my more formative years, it still doesn't really appeal to me. But tension, suspense, what's around the corner, what's coming next, when it's done right, and it isn't always, but when it is, that can sit with me forever. The scariest movie that I've ever seen, and I stand by this, it is still my number one scary movie I've ever seen. And maybe someday, if there's interest, I'll do a full deep dive into this thing. It's the 1978 version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Because the sense of paranoia, the sense of unease among the characters, the sense that they don't know who they can trust, you don't know if you can believe what you're seeing, that permeates the entire film. It's not gore-free. There's one gore-ish moment towards the tail end, but that's never what stuck with me. The scenes where characters are talking and they cannot figure out how to even get out of the city because there's no one they can reach out and contact, and they're not even entirely sure who can be trusted, if anybody. For all they know, they are the only people left in the city who have not been replaced by duplicates. That tension is basically the entire film. And that thing has stuck with me way more than any bloody or gory kill that I've ever seen in anything. And the degree to which a gory moment would have to take it to stick with me the way something like that movie stuck with me, it's going to be a level of gore that I just don't want to watch. Again, that is a personal taste thing, but I'm allowed to set my limits. I told you that I'd mention a PG-13 rated, incredibly tense, for me, very scary movie. The Ring. The American remake of The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski, I think is still a masterfully suspenseful film. One of the nice things about Suspense is because it does not require that visceral level that Gore goes into. Suspense can be supernatural. It can be alien. It can be just somebody stalking another human being. But I do find that when you have a true sense of I don't know what's going on, that can really ramp it up. And The Ring does that really well. And are there some moments of like unsettling imagery in terms of like the way some of the bodies are twisted and shaped? Like, yeah, but again, it got away with a PG-13. So I think that says a lot. Another one, The Woman in Black, starring Daniel Radcliffe. Also PG-13, also incredibly tense. Tension from darkness, from creaking floors, from slow pans, from a chair rocking out of nowhere. Small, tiny things just presented at a pace and in a way that doesn't feel like it's killing time until the gore is here. This is why you're here. This is the point. And I think that's another thing for me. When gore is more of the intended point of a thing, it can often, for me, feel like the time in between the gory moments is filler. Now, ideally, it's still entertaining filler, but it can really feel like, yeah, okay, when do we get to the next kill? Let's pick up the pace here. To me, someone working their way down a dark hallway can get to me far more than any quantity of blood or amount of prosthetic viscera. And not necessarily because I'm expecting a jump scare. The best suspenseful movies can make me feel tense even when I still know what's coming. I can watch Jaws and still feel that tension as it builds, as the music kicks in. And I'm not going to bring up the rating of that one. Technically, it's PG, but like it existed before the PG-13 rating. As it is, it would maybe be R now? I don't know. Up in the air. But like, I'm not going to bring up the rating there because PG was a whole different thing back then. But I can watch a movie like that. I can watch The Woman in Black. I can watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers and still get tense. Even though it can't jump scare me. If there are jump scares in those movies, I have them memorized a long time ago, but I still get tense. I still feel myself tighten up a little bit when everything's hitting right. But it's kind of wrong of me to imply that tension, suspense, and gore are incompatible. I mean, there are things like The Thing, which I mentioned, although ultimately I do feel that one leans more on gore than on tension. The tension is there, certainly in some scenes, but taken as a whole, it's more of a gore feature than a tension feature. It's just got more tension than I think is standard for a lot of gore-focused movies. But there is one movie that I think gets the balance 100% perfectly. And it has one famously gory scene. But that's kind of it. But it is legitimately gory. And the tension as it built to it, and the tension that comes after it. Because so oftentimes, gore relieves the tension. Like, all this tense moments. Oh, like, what's going to happen? Gore! Oh, okay. There's the thing that happened. Kind of like how as a comedian or a comedic movie is building up the tension before the punchline of something, and then the relief is the laugh. With Gore, the relief is the, okay. Now that tension's gone. That tension's relieved. But I can definitely think of a movie where when the gore happened, tension wasn't gone. The tension ratcheted up. And it kept it the whole way through. And that moment of gore was not the end. It wasn't the climax. My friends, the original Alien, directed by Ridley Scott, with an astounding cast. Tense from the moment the crew of the Nostromo set down on that planet. Much less when they went into this ship, saw this being, didn't know what any of it was. And unfortunately, I can't project myself back to a time of not knowing what the xenomorph is. I've always known, even before I saw the movie. I just by cultural osmosis and frickin' Spaceballs, I knew what it was. But I can still get a sense, just because of how well that tension is still preserved. That tension up until the face hugger ends up on a member of the crew. And then the relaxation in the cantina until he starts to cough. The thing's not on his face anymore. He should be fine. I don't know. What's going on? That chest bursting scene is not just iconic because it's unexpected. And it's not just iconic because it's gory. It's iconic because it ratchets up everything. There was a tiny lull in the tension when the facehugger wasn't on him anymore. But now everything just went to hell. And it does it in a moment of very visceral gore that just projects the film into its second half, and it is on rocket fuel from there out. It holds the tension of this thing is now on the ship. It holds that tension to the point that it doesn't have to show you any of the other kills in any detail. And it doesn't. It doesn't need to. Darkness, sound, implication. You don't need the gore every time because you had the taste of what this thing, just as this little tiny thing bursting out of somebody. You got a sense of what it can do, and now it's bigger. One could argue that the destruction of Ash, the android, is also a moment of gore, and I would say a little bit, not quite on the same level. So call it a secondary sort of top-up. A little bit more. But there's no actual blood, and it is an unsettling image, to be sure. the way he looks when they smash him up, but it's not the same. But taken as a whole, altogether, that movie is a perfect melding of suspense and gore in a way that I can't think of any other film that's done it since. And it's why, ultimately, if you're going to make me pick one, I'm going to pick Suspense. But if you want to point me to something else that balanced both, as well as the original Alien did, I want to hear about it. Give me some recommendations down in the comments. Let's talk about it. What are your thoughts on my notions of sort of dividing these two ways of approaching things in general? I mean, as I said, this is a perspective partially informed by just my age. 40s, woo! Middle age. Oh, that's a terrifying thought. It's reality, though. But whatever your thoughts are on any of this, down in the comments, let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills, enables me to do this as my living. But don't worry too much about that. Like, share, subscribe. It all helps me out. What I really want you to remember, though, is that you are beautiful, you are valid, you are loved, you are the council. I am just running the meetings, and until next time this council is adjourned, be safe this Halloween, and have fun. Time to thank some Patreon backers, and in the spirit of October, I'd like to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Goddess Alita, Turok, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Christopher B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernobulax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Dave Hall, and Rosalind Bennett. Thank you for your assistance. I don't know, I might try theming the shoutouts in the future. I don't know, we'll see. Thank you.